Story: The River of Identity. The traveler stood upon the ancient banks of the Ganges as the twilight deepened into a rich indigo hue over the vast Magadha plains. He had reached his 40th year of existence, a threshold that felt like the summit of a steep mountain where the path forward seemed to descend into an unknown mist. Behind him lay the dusty roads of trade and the noisy marketplaces of Shravasti, where he had accumulated wealth and a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. Yet in the stillness of the evening, the weight of his achievements felt like heavy stones carried in a silken bag. He watched the great river churn and swirl around the jagged rocks at the edge of the water, observing how the liquid form adapted to every obstacle without losing its essential nature. His mind had become a rigid structure of expectations and historical narratives where every success was a brick and every failure was a crack in the foundation. He realized that the crisis of his middle years was not a loss of external power, but a refusal to acknowledge the internal current that had always been moving beneath the surface of his social identity. The Buddha sat under a distant peepal tree, his presence a silent invitation to observe the mechanics of clinging without judgment. The traveler noticed how his thoughts attempted to grasp the moving water and hold it still in his imagination, a feat as impossible as holding on to the youth that had slipped through his fingers like dry sand from the riverbed. He saw that the pain within his chest was the friction created by a static mind resisting a dynamic universe. The river did not mourn the water that had passed downstream, nor did it fear the arrival of the snowmelt from the high peaks of the north. It existed in a state of perpetual arrival and departure. This realization began to dissolve the hardened shell of his ego, allowing a newfound fluidity to permeate his awareness. He understood that the man who had arrived at the riverbank was already gone, replaced by a succession of momentary impressions and cellular shifts that left no permanent trace. The architecture of his past, which he had guarded so fiercely, was revealed to be a phantom construction of memory and desire. By letting go of the need to be a fixed point in a spinning world, he found a profound sense of relief that washed over him like the cool spray of the current. The heavy burden of maintaining a consistent persona fell away, replaced by the lightness of being a process rather than a person. He watched the light fade from the sky and felt the cool air of the evening touch his skin, recognizing that the observer within him was not bound by the cycles of growth and decay. The river continued its journey toward the distant ocean, indifferent to the labels of success or failure that men carved into the earth. In this silence, he discovered that the middle of life is not a peak to be defended, but a bridge to be crossed with open hands and an empty heart. He contemplated the way the water reflected the stars beginning to appear in the overhead canopy. Each reflection was perfect, yet none of them possessed the substance of the star itself. His life was much the same, a series of reflections on the surface of a moving stream. The anxiety that had gripped him for months began to lose its hold as he saw the absurdity of trying to anchor a boat in a river that never stopped flowing. He breathed in the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, feeling the rhythm of his own lungs as part of the larger respiration of the forest. The fear of aging was simply the fear of a story coming to an end, but he now saw that the story was never his to begin with. It was merely a sequence of causes and conditions arising and passing away in the vast space of consciousness. As the moon rose, he turned away from the bank, feeling a strange and beautiful anonymity. The merchant was dead, but the life that had moved through him was more vibrant than ever. He walked into the shadows of the trees with a step that was light and unburdened by the ghosts of yesterday. Story: The Echo in the Bamboo Grove. Deep within the bamboo grove of the Yatavana monastery, an elder seeker sat upon a flat stone as the monsoon rains began to drum a rhythmic pattern against the broad leaves. He had once been a trusted advisor to a powerful king, spending his days navigating the complexities of statecraft and the delicate balance of power. Now in the autumn of his life, he found himself haunted by the echoes of his former glory and the creeping dread that his best years were behind him like a sun that had already crossed the meridian. The sound of the rain was a constant reminder of the relentless passage of time, each drop a tiny messenger of change. He watched a single leaf detach from a high branch and spiral slowly toward the muddy ground, noting how his mind immediately labeled the event as a loss or a sign of decay. This mental habit of categorizing the natural world into categories of gain and loss was the very source of his inner turmoil. He observed the mechanics of his own perception, seeing how the mind constructed a solid version of the self out of the fleeting memories of his youth. The Buddha walked nearby with a slow and measured gait, his eyes downcast and his mind settled in the present moment. The seeker realized that his midlife crisis was actually a crisis of imagination, a failure to see the beauty in the transition from the flower to the seed. He saw that he was clinging to a ghost of a man who no longer existed, trying to animate a corpse of memories with the breath of his current anxiety. The bamboo shifted in the wind, creaking with a sound that seemed to speak of the strength found in flexibility. He began to understand that the essence of his suffering was the belief in a permanent core that remained unchanged while the world moved on. As he sat in the damp stillness, he focused on the sensation of his breath, the rising and falling of his chest that occurred without his conscious effort. He saw that the breath was the ultimate teacher of evanescence, showing him that life is only possible through a continuous process of receiving and releasing. If he tried to hold the breath, he would die. And if he tried to hold on to his youth, he would lose the vitality of his present wisdom. The grove seemed to expand around him, the green shadows becoming a sanctuary for his tired spirit. He noticed the tiny insects seeking shelter under the leaves and the way the water carved small channels in the earth. Nothing was trying to stay the same. The very atoms of his body were in a state of constant flux, dancing to a silent music that had no beginning and no end. The titles he had held and the honors he had received were like clouds passing across the face of the moon, momentarily bright but ultimately without substance. He felt the tension in his shoulders dissolve as he surrendered to the reality of his own transformation. The fear of being forgotten by the world was replaced by the joy of being part of the world in its most fundamental form. He saw that the middle of his journey was not a decline, but a deepening, an invitation to move from the surface of things to the profound depths of being. The rain stopped as quickly as it had begun, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet stone and renewed life. He stood up from his seat and felt the strength in his limbs, recognizing that the power he had once sought in the halls of kings was nothing compared to the power of a mind that is at peace with change. He walked through the grove with a quiet heart, knowing that every step was both a beginning and an ending. The path beneath his feet was ancient, yet every moment it was made new by the touch of his soles. He was no longer a man chasing a fading light, but a man who had become the light itself. Story: The Granite Peak. The former commander of the royal chariots climbed the winding path toward the heights of Gidakuta as the first light of dawn touched the jagged edges of the mountain range. His breath came in heavy, uneven rhythms, a stark departure from the effortless stamina that had once defined his presence on the battlefields of Kosala. In the silence of the high altitude, the internal architecture of his pride began to reveal its structural flaws. He was 48 years of age, a period where the physical vessel begins to signal its eventual return to the elements. And this transition had triggered a profound sense of existential vertigo within his consciousness. Every ache in his joints felt like a betrayal by a body he had once commanded with absolute authority. He looked down at his hands, scarred and weathered by decades of sun and steel. Realizing that the identity of the invincible warrior was merely a mental image projected onto a changing screen of biological processes. The mind, in its desperate attempt to maintain a sense of continuity, had clung to the memory of his strength as if it were a permanent attribute rather than a temporary condition. He observed the movement of his own thoughts as they surged with resentment toward the natural decline of his vigor. This resentment was the primary engine of his midlife suffering, a friction generated by the collision between a static self-perception and the unstoppable momentum of time. The Buddha sat upon a ledge overlooking the valley, his stillness so absolute that he seemed to be an extension of the granite itself. The seeker paused, noting how the mountain did not resist the wind or the rain that slowly sculpted its face into new forms. He began to analyze the components of his discomfort, breaking down the sensation of age into its constituent parts of pressure, warmth, and pulsing energy. When viewed through this lens of empirical observation, the terrifying ghost of aging dissolved into a series of neutral phenomena. He realized that the crisis was not occurring in his body, but in the narrative he had woven around the body. The dissolution of his former role was not a catastrophe, but a liberation from a restrictive costume. He saw that the essence of his awareness was not composed of bone or muscle, nor was it diminished by the slowing of his gait. The mountain air was crisp and indifferent, carrying the scent of dry earth and ancient stone. He sat down near the edge of the path, allowing his awareness to expand beyond the narrow confines of his skin. He felt the vibration of the earth and the vastness of the sky, recognizing that he was not a separate entity fighting against the universe, but a participant in its grand unfolding. The heavy armor of his social status had long since been discarded, yet the mental armor of his ego had taken much longer to shed. In this moment of clarity, he understood that the middle years are a gateway to a different kind of power, the power of a mind that no longer needs to conquer the world because it has understood the world. The fear of death was revealed to be a fear of losing something that was never truly possessed. He watched a hawk circle in the thermals, effortless and unattached to the ground below. His mind mimicked the flight of the bird, rising above the petty concerns of legacy and reputation. The silence of the mountain became his own silence, a deep and resonant stillness that contained all the sounds of the world without being disturbed by them. He breathed in the vastness of the horizon, feeling the ancient rhythm of the cosmos pulsing in his own veins. The man who had feared the sunset now welcomed the shadows, knowing that the light would return in 1,000 different forms. He was no longer a soldier of the king, but a witness to the eternal dance of creation and destruction. The peak was not the end of the journey, but a vantage point from which to see that the journey had no destination other than the present moment. Story: The Unwoven Thread. The golden hour cast long shadows across the courtyard of a wealthy merchant house near the city of Vaishali, where a woman of 50 years sat before an ancient loom. For decades, she had been the silent architect of her family prosperity, weaving the threads of lineage, wealth, and social standing into a complex tapestry that everyone admired. Yet, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, she felt a profound hollowness in the center of her chest, a sense that the fabric of her life was unraveling at the edges. The children had grown and departed for distant cities, and the influence she once wielded in the local guild was beginning to fade like the colors of an old garment left in the sun. She watched the shuttle move back and forth, realizing that her entire existence had been a series of repetitive movements designed to create a sense of permanence in a world that allowed none. Her mind was caught in a loop of retrospective analysis, questioning the value of every choice and the reality of every achievement. This was the crisis of the middle path, the the realization that the structure she had built was not a fortress, but a temporary shelter. The Buddha passed by the gate of her courtyard, walking with the grace of one who carries nothing and therefore possesses everything. She looked at the raw silk in her hands, seeing it not as a potential product, but as a collection of fibers that had once been part of a living creature. Everything was in a state of borrowing. The house, the gold, and even the memories of her youth were merely borrowed from the storehouse of nature. The suffering she felt was the interest she was paying on the attachment to these borrowed things. She closed her eyes and focused on the sound of the wind through the neem trees, letting the noise of her inner dialogue fade into the background. She began to perceive the substancelessness of the self that she had spent 50 years protecting and promoting. This self was not a solid diamond, but a whirlpool in a stream, maintaining its shape only through the constant influx and efflux of water. When the flow changed, the whirlpool would vanish, and there was no tragedy in its disappearance because the water remained. This insight began to transform her relationship with the passing of time. She saw that her midlife crisis was a gift of clarity, a breaking of the spell that had kept her bound to the illusion of control. The anxiety about her fading beauty and declining influence was replaced by a fascination with the mechanics of change itself. She watched a spider spinning a web in the corner of the porch, noting how it did not mourn when a gust of wind tore the delicate threads. It simply began again, driven by the impulse of life rather than the ego of the builder. She felt a deep sense of peace as she allowed the image of the perfect matriarch to dissolve. She was no longer the weaver. She was the weaving itself, an ongoing process of experience that required no final result to be meaningful. The evening air grew cool, and the scent of jasmine drifted from the garden, reminding her that the beauty of the flower lies in its brevity. She understood that her life was not a project to be completed, but a symphony to be heard. The fear of the future was merely a projection of a mind that had forgotten how to live in the present. As she stood up from the loom, her movements were fluid and unhurried. The burden of legacy had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving her with the lightness of a leaf on the water. She walked toward the well in the center of the yard, seeing her reflection in the dark mirror of the water. The face looking back was older, but the eyes were clear and free from the fog of desire. She realized that the most beautiful thread she had ever spun was the one that now connected her to the infinite silence of the world. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars began to blink in the velvet sky, signaling the start of a night that she no longer feared. Every moment was a departure, and every breath was a return. Story: The Stillness of the Silver Lake. The elder scribe sat by the edge of a mountain lake near the peaks of Rajgir as the silver light of a waning moon cast long, ethereal shadows across the mirror like surface of the water. He had spent 45 years recording the wisdom of the ages on palm leaves, his mind a vast reservoir of verses, philosophies, and historical lineages that he had guarded with the tenacity of a lion. Recently, however, he had begun to notice a subtle thinning of his mental faculties, a slight delay in the retrieval of a name or the precise phrasing of a complex metaphysical argument. This perceived decline had sparked a silent panic within him, a midlife crisis that manifested as a desperate attempt to shore up the walls of his intellectual fortress. He watched a small pebble roll down the bank and break the surface of the lake, creating a series of concentric rings that expanded until they vanished into the surrounding darkness. His mind was exactly like that water, a medium for impressions that arose and subsided, yet he had spent his life identifying with the ripples rather than the depths. He observed the mechanics of his own anxiety, seeing how his intellect attempted to grasp the past and project it into the future to create a sense of stable identity. The Buddha sat in the shadows of a nearby cave, his presence a silent testament to the peace that remains when all striving for self-preservation is abandoned. The scribe realized that his suffering was the result of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of memory and thought. He had mistaken the collection of accumulated data for a solid soul, and now that the data was shifting, he felt as though his very existence was being eroded. He focused on the sensation of the cool mountain air entering his nostrils, noticing how each breath was a unique event that required no history to be complete. The lake did not try to hold onto the reflection of the moon, nor did it mourn when the clouds obscured the light. It remained an open and receptive space, indifferent to the quality of the images that played across its skin. He saw that the wisdom he had spent a lifetime transcribing was not something to be possessed, but something to be lived in the immediate present. The fear of losing his mental sharpness was revealed to be a fear of losing the illusion of permanence that he had carefully constructed over decades. As he sat in the profound silence, the need to be the keeper of the word began to dissolve, replaced by the simple reality of being a witness to the unfolding moment. He watched the way his mind generated a thought of inadequacy, and then watched that thought fade away like the evening mist over the valley. There was no one behind the thought to claim it. The transition of his middle years was not a loss of treasure, but a clearing of the path, a removal of the clutter of concepts that had prevented him from seeing the world as it truly was. He felt a deep and resonant joy bubbling up from the center of his being, a joy that was not dependent on achievement or recognition. The mountain stood firm, the lake remained still, and the scribe finally understood that the most profound knowledge is the realization that there is nothing to hold on to. He breathed out slowly, releasing the last remnants of his academic pride into the night air. The crisis had been the labor pains of a new kind of awareness, one that did not rely on the continuity of the intellect, but on the vastness of the spirit. He stood up with a heart that was as light as the moonbeams on the water, ready to walk the path without the burden of being someone important. Every step was a homecoming, and every moment was an eternity. Story: the dust of the great road. The master builder of stupas stood upon the dusty highway that connected the kingdom of Magadha to the lands of the west as the sun began to set in a blaze of crimson and gold. He had spent 60 years carving stone and laying foundations, leaving a trail of monuments across the landscape that he believed would speak his name to the generations of the future. Now, standing amidst the swirling dust raised by the passing caravans, he felt a sudden and overwhelming sense of the futility of his labor. He looked at his aged hands, their joints swollen and their skin like parched earth, and realized that he was just as subject to the laws of erosion as the temples he had built. This was the heavy realization of his later years, a midlife crisis that had arrived late but with the force of a monsoon flood. He watched the travelers pass by, each one focused on a destination that lay somewhere beyond the horizon, oblivious to the history of the road beneath their feet. His mind was a hive of activity, attempting to reconcile the permanence of the stone with the impermanence of the flesh. He observed how his ego sought comfort in the idea of a legacy, a mental construct that attempted to bypass the reality of death. The Buddha walked among a group of monks on the shoulder of the road, his feet touching the earth with a gentleness that left no mark on the shifting soil. The builder noticed how the dust settled back into place after the monks had passed, leaving no trace of their journey. He began to understand that the true nature of his work was not the creation of lasting objects, but the participation in a vast and intricate web of interdependence, where every action influenced the whole without needing to endure forever. He saw that the stones he had carved were not separate from the mountains they came from, nor were they separate from the hands that shaped them, or the eyes that would eventually see them crumble. This realization shifted the center of his awareness from the product to the process. The suffering he felt was the result of trying to isolate himself from the flow of change, trying to carve a static self out of the moving river of life. He sat by the side of the road and focused on the rhythmic sound of the cicadas, letting the noise of his internal ambitions fade into the background. He saw that the middle of his life was not a point of decline, but a point of integration, where the wisdom of the earth could finally penetrate the arrogance of the maker. The dust was not an enemy, but a reminder of the fundamental unity of all things. He felt the tension in his mind begin to slacken as he accepted the eventual disappearance of his name and his works. This acceptance did not lead to despair, but to a profound sense of freedom. He was no longer a man burdened by the need to build a mountain. He was a man who could finally enjoy the shade of the trees. He watched the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky, recognizing that they too were born and would eventually die in the vast expanse of time. The crisis of his identity was resolved in the understanding that there was no separate self to protect. He was the road, he was the dust, and he was the light of the setting sun. The heavy stones of his pride had been transformed into the light fabric of his being. He stood up and continued his journey, not toward a specific destination, but into the heart of the present moment. The road was long, but he was no longer tired, for he had found the source of energy that does not depend on the strength of the body. He walked into the twilight, a master builder who had finally learned how to build a house of peace within his own soul. The wind carried the scent of the river and the sound of the evening bells, and he knew that he was exactly where he needed to be.